Welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. My name is David Lesher. I'm the Government Affairs Director at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California. And I'm sure many of you know PPIC well or are aware of it, but we are an independent, nonpartisan think tank based in San Francisco with offices here in Sacramento. Julian Betts today is going to give our presentation about a report he did with his co-authors who he'll introduce called Passing the California High School Exit Exam. Have recent policies improved student performance? Julian is a Bren Fellow at PPIC. He's also an economics professor at UC San Diego. He's done a number of reports for PPIC about evaluation of various interventions in education, including a 2008 report that he may refer to for PPIC that relates to what he's going to talk about today. So with that, please welcome Julian Betts.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming today. This report is co-authored. I've got some great co-authors without whom this would not be possible. We've got here today Andrew Zhao, Karen Backover from the San Diego Education Research Alliance at UCSD, and our fourth co-author, Jendrik Zeleniak, could not be here today. So we're delighted to be presenting this. We're going to be talking mostly about recent policy interventions and whether they've helped get students over the hurdle on this very important exit exam. So I'll talk a little bit about the goals of CASE and the impact of CASE on students. Then we'll focus in on recent interventions designed to help students get over the hump to pass both the math and English language arts components of the test. Then we're going to make an argument that we should probably be moving towards intervening to help students even earlier than we already are. And part and parcel of that is being able to forecast before the exit exam who's likely to have trouble with it. And then we will unveil the CASE early warning model. I'll give you a brief description of that. And very briefly, in the ending, we'll talk about some policy implications of our work. So I think most of you in the room are very familiar with the CASE, especially if you have a high school student in your family. Beginning with the graduating class of 2006, this was a binding requirement. You cannot obtain a high school diploma in California unless you pass both the math and the English language arts components of this exit exam. The two goals I've heard espoused in favor of the exit exam most frequently are, first of all, that it's a way of measuring and signifying to the labor market that high school graduates in California have mastered a basic set of skills. The second motive isn't said out loud as often, but I think it's clearly there, that the institution of this graduation requirement was put in place to boost achievement, to make schools focus on students who had borderline skills and to really help them. How's this actually played out in practice? Well, many students struggle to pass this exam. The first attempt for each student to pass this exam is in grade 10, and statewide results for 2010 show that just under 1 out of 3 students failed at least one of the two components of the exit exam in grade 10. Now they have multiple attempts in grades 11 and 12 to pass both sections, but even by grade 12, 1 out of 16 students was still not passing the CASE. So this is a binding requirement that is affecting graduation rates for at least some students throughout the state of California. So that's all I'll say by way of introduction. We want to really focus now fairly carefully on various interventions. And here I'll be talking about state-supported interventions as well as a homegrown intervention created by San Diego Unified School District. All of our analysis comes from San Diego Unified School District. We've been working with them collaboratively for a dozen years now. The first thing I want to mention is Assembly Bill 128. This was passed in 2005. The intent of this program was to provide tutoring and a whole set of support services to grade 12 students who had yet to pass both sections of the exit exam. The bill was extended in a later year to provide for support not just for grade 12 students but also for grade 11 students who had yet to pass the exit exam. AB 347 was passed in 2007, and the goal of this law was to mandate that districts do everything they could in their power to re-enroll students who'd finished grade 12 but who had yet to fulfill the CASE requirement, to encourage them to re-enroll in the district and to provide those students with supports for up to 2 years past grade 12 in a bid to really help them get that that high school diploma. Assembly Bill 1802 is not something that we explicitly address in the study, but I think it's important to mention it. This provided about $200 million in funding initially to hire more counselors in middle schools and high schools throughout the state. These additional counselors had many new tasks, among which were identifying students who were at risk of failing the exit exam, counseling students and their families on things that they could do to prepare for the exam, to get ready to take the exam for a second time or a third time in grade 11 and 12, and also to remind students that they were welcome back after grade 12 if they had not graduated. And then the final bullet on this slide is the homegrown intervention in San Diego Unified that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Even before the passage of AB 128, San Diego Unified created a series of what they call prep courses. These are year-long courses, either in math or English language arts, where the content being focused on very closely was the content being tested on the CASE. So for example, in math, the focus was largely on pre-algebra, but somewhat on algebra as well. Part of these courses, in addition to teaching content, focused on teaching students how to take tests. So there's a strategic part to these courses. We're not able to disentangle whether these courses are having an impact because of the content that's being taught or because of the strategic part of the course, teaching people how to become better test takers. So let's go through and talk about AB 128, AB 347, and the CASE prep classes. AB 128 was phased in. Initially, it was only to support grade 12 students. With later cohorts of students, grade 11 students were eligible as well. So that creates what economists would call a natural experiment. We've got some cohorts of students who received these supports in grade 11, others who did not. So when we analyzed and compared cohorts in that way, we did not find a noticeable effect of the AB 128 supports for students. We found a positive effect, but it was nowhere close to being what we call statistically significant. So there may be some effect here, but it's really, really hard to detect, and our estimated effect is not particularly large. AB 347 has a very different goal, and remember that's the Assembly bill which mandated districts to do everything they could to re-enroll students after grade 12 and to bring them back. This started to work for the class of 2007. So the class of 2006 was bound by the high school exit exam but did not receive these services immediately after grade 12. And what we're plotting here is re-enrollment rates. And you find that about 12.5% of students who'd failed to graduate at the end of grade 12 came back and re-enrolled. Now, on that chart, we're also showing the dark subbar is showing non-diploma bound students who are re-enrolling for a reason that had nothing to do with CASE, we believe. These are students who are a subset of students in special education who were taking life skills classes for several years after grade 12 anyway. You don't see many diploma-bound students re-enrolling in the class of 2006. The class of 2007 was the first class which was eligible for AB 347 supports, and you see a big increase in re-enrollment, up to about 30%. The classes of 2008 and 2009, re-enrollment percentages are even higher. About half of students who failed to graduate re-enroll in high school. Now, we need to be extremely careful about this because, as you no doubt remember, 2008 and 2009 were horrible years for the economy. And Hans Johnson of PPIC was kind enough to provide us with statistics showing that for young people who didn't have a high school diploma, unemployment rates shot through the roof in 2008, 2009. So some of these big gains for these latter two cohorts here probably are induced by the recession. But we're pretty confident about that big gain for the class of 2007 not being induced by the recession. So we come away from this believing that AB 347 really did succeed in getting more students back into school after grade 12. That's the good news. Now, the ultimate goal of AB 347 is not just to bring students back to high school, is to bring them back and to prep them for the exit exam and to have them pass. Here are the raw data on pass rates. You see that for the class of 2006, a fraction of 1% of students came back the next year and fulfilled the CASE requirement. You see a boost up to about 4 or 5% of students passing for the classes of 2007 and 2008. For reasons we don't understand, the class of 2009, even though their enrollment rates were 50%, almost none of those students actually passed the CASE the year after. We back this up with a statistical analysis where we control for what the student's academic profile looked like at the end of grades 10 and grade 11. And we were finding, roughly speaking, maybe 5% of students who failed to graduate might come back and pass the KC as a result of AB 347. So there's some room for optimism here. There does seem to be a positive effect, but most of the students who failed to graduate are not later passing the KC as a result of AB 347. Let's turn to the KC prep classes next, and this is something that San Diego developed on its own, independent of state mandates. I think other districts around the state are implementing similar sorts of preparatory classes. So let me begin just by showing you data that Andy put together showing the number of students taking these classes by class and grade. The San Diego School Board sanctioned and created these courses initially to provide supports to students in grades 11 and 12 who had yet to pass the KC. So we focus our formal analysis on exactly that. What happens to students in grades 11 and 12? But you'll notice that towards the end of this table, the classes of 2008, 2009, a lot of those students are beginning to take prep classes, not in grades 11 and 12, but actually earlier. And this is something that Andy and I had actually recommended in our PPIC report back in 2008, intervening a little bit earlier. Our formal analysis, though, really for this report focused on the grade 11 and 12 enrollments in prep classes. Now, we don't have a nice natural experiment here like we did for AB 128 with the policy not existing and then being turned on. Any student who was subject to the exit exam requirement was offered these classes. But if anything, it looks like what the district was doing was focusing not on students who had almost passed the KC, they were focusing on students who were far below the cut point for passing. So when we do a statistical analysis, if anything, we're going to have a bias suggesting that these prep classes should be hurting students. That's not actually what we found. Here's what we found. There is, once I take you through this graph, there's lots of good news, but also some not so good news. Let's start with the bad news. If you look at the orangish brown bars on this graph, this is showing for each year from our statistical models the predicted effect on the probability of passing the exit exam overall if you've taken any prep class, be it in math or English language arts. And you find that in the first 3 years, 2005 to 6 through 2007 to 8, there really was not a big effect on overall passage of the KC. 2008, 2009 looks quite different. In that year, students who took a prep class were about 8% more likely to complete both the KC requirements. So we're not quite sure why that's happening. It could be that teachers in San Diego are becoming more and more adept at teaching these courses as time goes by. So there's some good news here, but it's very muted in the sense that it seems like it's not quite enough to get students over the double hurdle of having to pass both math and English language arts. The next two bars in sort of blue and gray here are showing the predicted effects of taking an ELA prep class on passing the ELA part of the exit exam. We thought that would be a more direct way of testing whether these classes worked. And you see that for English language arts, these middle bars here, there's a statistically significant effect on the probability of passing each year. In the early years, it looks like a student who takes an ELA prep class in grade 11 or 12 has almost a 10% increased chance of passing the ELA section of the exit exam. It skyrockets to about a third. In other words, a 33% increase in the probability of passing in 2008, 2009. The lighter gray bars, the rightmost bar in these trios of bars over here, are showing the predicted effects of taking a math prep class each year on passing the math component of the exit exam. We find that there's a positive, statistically significant effect every single year, and it tends to grow over time, as you can see. So these are effects that are increasing probability of passing by anywhere from about 7.5% to a little over 20%. So we're finding extremely promising results for passage of one section of the KC exam, but much weaker results for passing the exit exam requirement overall. Now, why is that? Well, it's because if a student fails the math component of the exit exam in grade 10, by and large, the majority of those students also failed the other component of the exit exam. So taking a year-long course in math prep might get you over one of the hurdles, but not both. We think that's what's going on here. Let's put all these things together. We've got AB 128, AB 347, and the KC prep classes. What we're showing in this graph is the most optimistic predicted impacts of these three programs put together. And what we're showing here on the vertical axis is the percent of students who failed in grade 10 who ultimately passed the KC because of AB 347, AB 128, or because of the creation of these prep classes. And you see it varies by year. It increases a little bit over time. In 2007, we're getting roughly a 1.75% boost in the percentage of grade 10 failures who later do pass. And that's due almost solely to the AB 347 effect. 2008, 2009, the effects are bigger. This is when AB 128 tutoring kicks in. Now, we label this our optimistic set of estimates, and really we're leaning over backwards here to try to show the most optimistic results possible. What I mean by that is that we're including in this graph effects that are statistically insignificant, but they're often positive. So that applies to the AB 128 tutoring in particular, that they are predicted to boost passage rates by about 1.5%, but we can't reject the hypothesis. The real effect was zero. A more conservative estimate sets those statistically insignificant effects to zero. When you do that, you get, instead of a 3% boost in passage rates, about a 1.5% boost. So overall, our sense is that these three programs put together may have helped somewhere between 1.5% and 3% of the grade 10 students who failed to ultimately pass the exit exam within 2 years of completing grade 12. So there's some good news here, but it's fairly modest good news. So what should schools be doing? That's the obvious next question. I think we have a lot to learn about how to help students master basic skills. The argument that Andy and Karen and Yendrik and I want to make very forcefully is that it's great to intervene at the high school level for students who've already failed the exit exam, but it's really important to intervene earlier. That was one of the messages from the Julian Betts report 4 years ago. That's something that San Diego Unified is actually doing by moving these prep classes from grade 11 and 12 all the way down to grade 10 and now grade 9. So intervening earlier before students first have to take this exam in grade 10 might be a really good thing to do. Why should we intervene early? Well, here's some very specific reasons. Most of the skills that are being tested on the exit exam are skills that are taught in the upper elementary grades and the middle school grades. This is particularly clear for the math component of the exit exam, where the subject matter being tested is roughly at a grade 6 to 8 level. So it makes sense that if students are having trouble mastering those very basic skills, to give them assistance roughly in those grades where they're first being taught this, or not that long after. Don't wait to the 11th hour, to grade 11 or grade 12. We also think that it's probably the case that earlier support is going to be more cost effective. If you think about AB 347 for a second, on the one hand, it seems free. It's really just a mandate requiring districts to do everything they can to get students back after grade 12. But taxpayer money is going into ADA funding to bring those students back for up to 2 years after grade 12 to re-enroll them. That's a pretty expensive thing. It's exceptionally expensive from the student's point of view because they're giving up 1 or 2 years of their lives trying to get that much sought after high school diploma. So intervening early could save taxpayer money and could save students time as well. Our final argument in favor of early intervention is not something that we can prove, but it's something that we feel intuitively must be correct, and that is that constant support over multiple grades should be more effective than intervening in grade 12, trying to help grade 12 students master math material they should have learned in grades 5 through 8. Now, if you're going to intervene early, before students take the exit exam in grade 10, it has to be the case that you need to be able to identify students in grade 7, 8, 9 before they take the exit exam. Andy and I, in our 2008 PPIC report, looked at whether you could predict who's going to have success on the exit exam, either by grade 10 or by grade 12. We started with grade 9 data and found that if you use students' individual data at grade 9, you can predict really well who's going to fail that test in grade 10. So then we started moving back from grade 9, then we tried just grade 8 data. We went all the way back to grade 4, and we found, somewhat to our surprise, that you could forecast who was going to fail the exit exam in grade 10 almost as well using grade 4 data as you could using grade 9 data. So we had 2 extensions in mind for that PPIC report from 2008. The first was to see whether that model that we came up with 4 years ago was actually stable over time. What we mean by that is you can imagine a district spending a lot of money to come up with its own forecasting model. If that forecasting model doesn't work for the next cohort of students coming through, it's going to be kind of unwieldy and expensive for the district to have to re-estimate this model every single year. So what we did was take our published model from 4 years ago, based on the class of 2006, and see how well it predicted outcomes, actual outcomes, for the classes of 2007, 2008, and 2009. If the model holds up well over time, it means school districts could do this once and then use that tool repeatedly in future years. And if that holds up, then that was going to give us the confidence to create a slimmed down version of our model that any district in California could use to forecast KC success and failure on their own. So here's what we found first on whether these models hold up over time. This is going to take a little bit of time to explain, so bear with me here. What we're showing on the horizontal axis is 10 groups of students. Based on our model, the leftmost trio of bars that's labeled less than 0.1, these are students who, according to our model, had less than a 10% chance of passing the exit exam in grade 10. The rightmost trio of bars, way over here, is showing students who, according to our model, had a probability of 90% or higher of passing the KC. On the vertical axis, what we're showing is the percentage of students who actually did pass the KC. If we had no predictive power, then all these bars would be the same height. That's not what we find at all. If you start here at the bottom of the graph, students who we predicted to have less than a 10% probability of passing, sure enough, far less than 10% of those students actually did pass the exit exam in grade 10. Then going all the way over to the rightmost trio of bars, the students who had predicted probability of 0.9 or higher of passing, well, guess what? 95% of those students passed. The brown bars are showing the class of 2006. Those are the students we used to create that model 4 years ago. The other bars to the right of that, in various shades of Martha Stewart blue and gray, are showing the classes of 2007 through 2009. So we're extrapolating out a sample to see, hey, did it work for those students as well? And I think you'll agree with me when you look at this. We predict almost as well for the later years as we do for the early years. So that then gave us some confidence that a district could estimate a model like this once and not have to keep tinkering with it every year. Based on that knowledge, we've created a slimmed down version of our original model from our 2008 report. It uses a smaller number of variables, things like grade point average, CST scores, percent of days absent, gender, are you an English learner, are you a student in special education? And we use those in a forecasting model. We update it, we use it, the San Diego class of 2009 to create this model. And our hope is that other districts around the state may be able to use this simple tool to forecast on their own which students in their district are in the most need of support. So what exactly is the KC Early Warning Model? It's a set of Excel spreadsheets which can be downloaded from the PPIC website or from sandera.ucsd.edu. The ultimate goal here is to identify students using data either from grade 6 or from grade 8 to identify students who need help way before they get to grade 10. We chose grade 6 thinking that some middle schools might want to help students maybe starting in grade 7. We chose grade 8 because these data would be available to high schools when students are starting to enter grade 9 in fall of a given year. So the grade 8 model may be slightly more accurate because it's closer to the day in grade 10 when these students actually will take the exit exam. A downside to that, though, is that if you use the grade 8 forecasting model, you can intervene in grade 7 or 8. So we left it up to districts which way they'd like to go on this. The first thing a district would need to do would be to download what we call the validation Excel spreadsheets. And what they're going to do is to take a set of students who have already made it to grade 10. So we already know for this district who has passed the KC in grade 10 and who has failed. And we're going to validate the model by seeing how well the model actually predicted the actual outcomes. That's one of the key things that a district should be doing with the validation spreadsheet. There's another really interesting thing they can do with the validation spreadsheet, though, and that is to perform simulations. The district can go through for a recent cohort that's already made it to grade 10 and ask, suppose we pick students with a probability of passing the KC below 50%. How many students would that be? How many would we be serving? And of those students, would we be capturing most of the students who actually did fail the exit exam in grade 10? And are there any false positives? Are we putting into an intervention program students who, it turns out, passed the KC in grade 10 anyway? So here's an example of what that spreadsheet does. This is using actual data from San Diego Unified. So I don't know if you can see this in the back of the room, but if you pick row 78 here, this is the 0.5 cutoff. So let's suppose you've got an intervention program that you'd like to direct to students who've failed to pass the KC overall in grade 10, and according to this model, they've got less than a 0.5 chance. How many students would that be? It would be 1,168 students, so that's helpful for a district in terms of planning costs for an intervention program. Then the next question, addressed here in this next table, table 7, is what is the percentage of students who actually did fail in grade 10 who you would have reached if your cutoff point had been predicted probability below 0.5? Well, you would have, in this case, picked 65.3% of the students who ultimately did fail. And then the next table asks about the false positives. In other words, the students who, it turns out, passed the KC on their own in grade 10, how many of those students would have been put into an intervention program? If we picked 0.5, it would have been only 8.8% of those students. So my guess is the district might want to raise the bar a little bit. If you pick 0.7, you'd roughly double the number of students in the intervention. You'd get about 85% of students who actually failed in the intervention in that case. So that's what the validation tool does for a district. It may turn out this model doesn't work well for some districts. They might define GPA different ways from how San Diego does it. They might redesignate English learners as fluent English proficient at a different stage than San Diego Unified does. In that case, the district probably needs to estimate its own model, but we're guessing for a lot of districts this should actually work pretty well. And if this validation tool turns out to work pretty well, then they can use the forecasting spreadsheets, and those are meant to be looking forward, looking at students who've just completed either grade 6 or grade 8, trying to come up with forecasts of their probability of passing overall, of passing the math component and the ELA component. So putting this all together, what are some policy implications coming out of this report? AB 128 tutoring and support services, at least in grade 11, didn't seem to have a big impact in San Diego Unified. It may be different elsewhere, but we didn't find it had a very big impact. AB 347 did seem to work. It seemed to be extremely successful at getting students to re-enroll after grade 12. It was also successful, but much more modestly, in terms of getting students not just to re-enroll, but to take and pass the KC after grade 12. So there's some good news there, but it's not solving the whole problem, not even close. The prep classes that San Diego Unified has created seem to be quite helpful. We get very strong positive effects on passing the math component or the ELA component if you've taken a prep class in that given course, in that given subject area. But except for the final year, we're not finding a very big total impact on the probability of passing KC overall. Putting all these things together, the three of them, somewhere between 1.5 and at most 3% of students who fail the KC in grade 10 ultimately pass the KC as a result of these interventions. So we're helping, but we need to do more. What can individual districts do to help students? We think intervening early is a way to go. Something that the state did, I believe in 2009, was to take the AB 128 funds and put them into a pot of money along with other formal categorical program funds. These are funds that can be spent flexibly. We think that's a great idea because no longer are districts constrained to provide tutoring and other supports only to grade 11 and 12 students. They can actually use these funds if they wish to help students in grades 10, 9, even earlier. That's exactly what San Diego Unified is now doing. Districts may want to develop their own KC prep courses. We know some districts around the state that are doing this already. We don't know this for a fact, but our sense is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and doing prep classes before students take this test for the first time in grade 10 might be the best way to go. So you put these two things together, early warning on the one hand to identify students who are likely to fail before they get to taking the test in grade 10 for the first time, and combining that early warning with early intervention, together we think those two things might really be quite helpful in making sure not only that students pass this by the end of grade 12, but they pass it on their first attempt in grade 10.